everybody. Welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. It is me and it is Nate, and we have special guest Kenny Clips from the Young Turks, Ken Klippenstein. Ken, question number one: how funny still are the Krassenstein brother jokes to you?
Oh, I would say, the whole society has sort of moved on from it. It's really, even making those jokes makes you like Ben Shapiro talking.
But they came back, and we all just had a field day with you on that one. That was a good day. Probably not for you, but for the rest of us, it was funny.
I was actually laughing because you guys were all, like I said, you guys were Ben Shapiro talking about like the Budweiser frogs or something from the. So it's kind of like,
it's amazing though, because it does reveal that if you, as much as we all want to quit the hell site, if you quit, like you get so far behind so quickly that stuff enters into there's like lingua franca that you just won't understand. Right.
I would hate to see something on Facebook and just be if Hillary boomered Donald Trump, and I was just like, there's story behind this, and I would have missed it on Twitter, and it would have been great. And all I see is when it's ruined. Like it's like visiting some like blasted planet. Like I wonder what society lived here before, when it was green and verdant, and before it was ruined by somebody terrible. That's quitting Twitter.
It's like when you see Roman ruins and like, wow, it's so beautiful and picturesque. It's like, actually, archaeologists will tell you that everything was covered in wall-to-wall graffiti of dicks, and it's just like no one ever tells you that, but that's what Roman ruins were actually like.
Well, let's just turn it into vaporwave, and that's our society now.
So Ken, we brought you on to talk about the Krassensteins for sure, but also because you just had a huge piece come out in The Intercept where you were able to acquire documents that showed that the U.S. military is creating threat assessments for what they call anti-border wall extremists, among other things. And I wanted to talk to you about that and see if you could maybe paint a picture for the listeners about what you found, and also like what your take is on it overall, since you dig in this stuff quite often.
Yeah, so essentially I got it from someone in the Pentagon who felt bad about what's going on. And I should point out that although, there are plenty of conservatives in the military, a lot of them, at least the folks that I talk to, think the border mission is a joke. And you'll see in Congress, they'll try to argue, it's giving us, trading opportunities where we can, see how stuff might work on the ground. And you talk to anyone I talk to that's either been in these border rotations or has overseen them says that that's ridiculous. So with that, as a background sort of, what I got was a commander's update briefing that included a sort of list of threat assessments. What was surprising about that was that it sort of looks at a number of different border locations and mentioned like the threats from anarchists, and then also, quote, anti-border wall extremists, which I thought was kind of an interesting term, because when you look into how they define these, they have a number of significant event notifications accompanying these so-called threats, and a lot of these guys were just nonviolent protesters.
I also found it funny that in that concept of the operation slide, or like threat assessment slide that you got, they kept saying that the unregulated or like whatever unofficial border militias threat was low, and it's like, I don't know if I would go that far, considering in the last 12 months we've seen situations in which militias have tried to do citizens arrests, and basically armed militias have illegally detained immigrants.
Well, I think what these assessments are assessing is how dangerous are they to us, like us as if like the military.
The military. No, right. I get that.
Yeah,
but
Patriot Guard dudes aren't going to come and start shooting soldiers, and they're a threat certainly to everybody else. They're probably a threat to like the actual mission as well, because they're just out there dragging their dicks in the dirt and fucking everything up. But also at the same time, but we do this. I mean, this is not new or different. We always have a like, okay, who's out there and who and what kind of threat is it? And you can't just. I don't know. Are they considering the nonviolent protesters a high threat or a moderate threat, or is everybody just kind of a low threat?
Well, it's interesting because they list them alongside two or three other threats. Just looking at the threat estimate now, they've got TCO/gangs, which for listeners is transnational criminal organizations, in Trump parlance, MS-13, for instance. And then it's got general criminal activity. It's got the unregulated militias, and then protest/anarchists. So the documents themselves sort of look like they were required to answer a number of sort of intelligence questions, and they have those questions at the bottom of the threat estimate, which say, let me read one for you. When and where will protesters or anarchists pose a threat to T10 forces in the JOA? So it's like they're being prompted to respond to these things. And I sort of go into it in the piece. It seems like those questions are coming from the White House because a lot of this stuff is pursuant to the national emergency declaration by President Trump saying that there's a national emergency over undocumented immigration. But it's interesting because they assess the threats from these protesters / anarchists to be low in every one of the cases: Arizona, California, New Mexico, South Texas. But it's just interesting to me that they would list those the same thing under militias, which actually have done things, and then gangs and things like that. So I thought that was sort of ridiculous.
So your source that provided this, if you can comment on that, I'm just wondering, did they think that, I mean, because I've seen two lines of argument from the military, one being it's immoral, which is the one I agree with, that it's absolutely absurd, that it's basically for the purpose of political theater, it's weaponizing the situation of refugees, and basically at the same time that they're making everything as as challenging as possible for refugees to enter the country, they're also aggressively militarizing the border. And so there's the immorality argument. And then there's also the perhaps less political, but more like frustrated with the job argument that it's a waste of resources. And so I'm wondering, like, when you speak to people in the military, and if you don't want to comment on this one person, but just in general, what do you find is the dominant sort of motivating factor for them to want to like leak things?
Oh, it's such a mix, but I'll tell you, getting leaks has been a walk in the park on this stuff. And in the past, I mean, you guys know as well as I do, the military is not a big fan of media. And that kills me because I'm not a big fan of media either. Not like media as a concept of having, the fourth estate, but just the way that it looks and the kind of people that rise to the top. But in this case, it's like radically different. And I don't know if it's that, folks increasingly are, having multi-ethnic families, or that the military is so diverse, or what. But I would say the more conservative ones tend to have the more technocratic critique of that this is an idiotic waste of resources. And I mean, I've heard this a number of times. I was meant to go, fight such and such overseas somewhere, and I'm doing this ridiculous. It's even an element of like thinking this is beneath them, that they would do this stupid political kind of theater stuff.
Well, they understand that we're pointing our guns towards the wrong brown people is what that basically comes down to, Because as you said, diversity in the military, we have a lot of Hispanic people in the military, obviously, and we also have undocumented soldiers, and those soldiers end up getting deported, and Nate and I have discussed how it's dumb to venerate the troops over civilians, but I mean that's just me and Nate because we're good socialist boys. But for the most part, in the military, you see something like going down to the border and just like, what am I doing? Like you're sending people down there who's just like, keep your cousins out of here, or you have people that probably came to America and joined the military in a very similar situation, crossing the border, whether it was on foot or through refugee status or something. Like, now go down and stop that. So I do see like, ironically, the border wall is like the one thing that even soldiers. I mean, it's not like we're going to do anything. We're not going to stop doing the mission down there, but certainly you're going to find a lot of people who think that it's just stupid. As you said, I'm supposed to go overseas and shoot those brown people, not these brown people.
I had a soldier that I worked with at the National Training Center when I was a cadet in 2006. He was a bit older than me. So I was 21 and he was 26, 27. He'd been deployed twice. He was like stud scout platoon guy, had been, gone to ranger school, gone to sniper school. And he told me, he's like, sir, I crossed the border with my parents under the fence when I was 6. Like, I remember it. And his family got amnesty under Reagan, and that's how he was. He didn't have any documentation problem. But like, that's not an uncommon story.
I mean, yeah, I would say it's all of the above. So it's the bad technocratic one on the part of particularly conservatives, but like, there's definitely the moral one too. I think it's just increasingly difficult. Like, look at me. I'm half white. My mom was undocumented from El Salvador, and I think that's reflective increasingly of the demographics of the country, which I don't think is a bad thing. It makes it harder to advance these ethno-nationalist arguments.
But I guess it's just strange to me too because I really think that, for example, you quoted this in your Intercept piece about the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, basically ranting on Twitter about Antifa. Or I actually may not have been on Twitter, may have been elsewhere, but like the fixation in the Republican/reactionary mind is that this is like this imminent threat when the folks who actually are tasked with basically doing theater of racism down at the border realize how absurd it is, or at least it seems a number of them realize how absurd it is.
Yeah, that's true. There's even a sort of comic element to it, which was that when I started to look into where Patrick got that idea, all of this stuff, one of the threat notifications they got in the threat assessment was for a group called the Anti-Border Wall Convergence, which the sort of patient zero for that appears to have been an Andy No tweet. This thing never actually ended up happening. And then when I talked to folks that knew about this conversion event, it was sort of portrayed as it was going to be some huge Antifa uprising or something. And what I was told was that was nothing of the sort. It was supposed to be a sort of standard, nonviolent protest against the Trump immigration policies. But I wonder how much of this stuff is just is just politicians sort of like huffing the like right-wing media's stuff and then kind of getting into a hysteria over things that were never going to happen. It's almost like this human centipede of like just disinformation going around, and then they get scared about their own stuff and don't realize that this is just kind of for the rubes to get excited about.
Yeah, this is all just like grift fodder. I guess I think about it too because, this dovetails into the recent revelations about Stephen Miller, aggressively flooding the inboxes of conservative newspapers and journals, et cetera, over the past couple of years with full-on white nationalist stuff, like linking to American Renaissance, linking to VDare, things like that. There absolutely is, scared of my own shadow, which is Antifa kind of paranoia amongst the insane right-wing folks. But those people are in pretty elevated positions in the U.S. government. And so in a way, Dan Patrick doing that isn't necessarily out of line with, Stephen Miller, who was at one point working for Jeff Sessions and then now is the special advisor to Trump, whose goal he has made very clear is ending non-white immigration to the United States and deporting as many non-white people as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because people often look at this and just sort of laugh and be like, oh, there's no threat at the border, so it's going to be fine. But that doesn't necessarily mean that over time, in power systems, they tend to, over time, start to believe their own bullshit, I think. Just because there's, not necessarily a threat posed by these undocumented migrants doesn't mean that perhaps certain portions, particularly the politicals of the border authorities, might not start to see a threat where there isn't any. And it becomes not just political theater, but they start actually believing it. And then, hopefully this doesn't happen, but that might lead to some kind of kinetic sort of thing, which Well,
it's happened before, though. There was a situation in the 90s in which they did the same thing. And in that case, Marines wound up killing a teenage boy who, as I understand it, was an American citizen. It was just, he was out ranching. He was out checking on his animals. And they saw him and shot him. And this led to a lawsuit, but they were never charged. They were cleared by the Marine Corps. But, this was in the 90s. And so, like I said, when you talk about it going kinetic, it's like, yeah, I think that there was already the threat of that whenever you have any kind of military presence in a situation, where they're being told that there's the possibility of a threat. There's always, if they have live rounds, there's always the possibility of something like this happening. But then also it seems that the rhetoric has ratcheted up so much more aggressively, since the late 90s. And now, you have this very kind of intensely, I don't know, like damn the facts kind of, like the Trumpist kind of belief that it really doesn't matter what anyone tells you. If you got it from a forwarded email or Donald Trump said it, it's true. And that means that, basically every single person trying to seek refugee status in the United States it's actually Al-Qaeda and MS-13 somehow.
And they actually said that about the border, about the migrant caravan. And actually in the document, I didn't focus on this as much, but they had a threat assessment for the migrant caravan, and they were looking at whether or not it was penetrated by foreign intelligence.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, this is something that at least the segments of the military are actually producing reports on, and I don't know how seriously they take it, but they are actually producing intelligence product.
Well, yeah, I think in that regard, and Francis can talk about this a little bit too, from his experience. But in my experience, like if that's what's being directed from above, you can't not do it.
Exactly.
Even if it's fucking stupid, you're still obligated to generate the report. When you work on a joint staff or something. If they say, assess this threat and determine, what exists and what we should do about it, you can't thumb your nose at it. And so in this regard, if Donald Trump says, there's a highly trained terrorist death squad that poses as mariachi bands, you have to do a report on whether or not terrorist mariachi bands are a threat.
Yeah, that's an important point for the left too, because we all sort of laugh at this stuff. But that's not necessarily mutually exclusive from it also becoming a real thing, even though it's ridiculous. And at the time, everyone knows that.
Yeah, and of course, those threats, a threat report is generated by a person. And much how we talk about how AI is not race neutral or gender neutral because they are created by a person. So goes an assessment like this. So like if I'm creating that assessment, they're like, Sergeant Horton, create a threat assessment for, this anarchist group that's coming. I'm going to, spend 10 minutes looking into it. I'm going to find out that they're probably just, some people with a Facebook page that says we're anarchists, and they're going to show up with some placards, and I'm going to say, they're low, whatever. They're going to come, they're going to yell at us, and then they're going to go away. But, you get some fucked up reactionary major who hates Antifa and loves Donald Trump. You're probably going to get something that maybe looks a little bit different, even if they are trying to be as unbiased as possible. You're going to get somebody's biases put into that. So even these reports, when they're being generated, are a load of bullshit because they just depend on who's generating the report itself. And then, but the problem is that a report like that, once it's put out, it's treated like a message from God. Like, this is it. This is our assessment, and this is what we're going to go off of. And we're going to change our operational tempos, and we're going to change our engagements, and we're going to do everything based on this report. And it could literally, based on whatever you're putting out there, everything can change. And danger levels can be elevated based on one report.
Yeah, that gets into my other story that I had about this, which is that they had changed the sort of rules of engagement and authorized them to use lethal force at ports of entry. And you have to wonder where that's coming from, because that wasn't something that existed even 3 or 4 months ago under the Trump administration. And then in that story, they also cite as justification these not specifically the assessments, but what they perceive as a sort of increase in the risk at these ports of entry.
Well, I was wondering too, Ken, if you thought this might be the case, because I realized in sharing this, like when I shared that the actual threat assessment slide that you shared with me, I quote tweeted it because I wanted to give it a little bit of context. That to me, I think the thing that was perhaps the most damning right off the bat was the fact that this is swap out a map, and it's indistinguishable from the kind of assessments that we were expected to produce when we were deployed to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and I imagine people deployed to the Philippines do, or people deployed to Syria do, or people who worked in Yemen before the official above board military presence in Yemen was ended. But to me, the threat assessment stuff, like reading it, I looked at it and I thought, okay, this is, what they're saying is not necessarily a distortion of the truth. It's just kind of an absurd thing. Like, yeah, the threat of fucking anti-border wall militias or anti-border wall extremists in scare quotes is low, because of course it's low, because those people are peaceful protesters, and they're not going to go and attack U.S. military forces. If they did, things wouldn't go well for them. But to me, there was an extent to which it seemed like the kind of military operations scope has shifted in such a way that it seems almost thoughtless to transplant it to the United States for domestic whatever missions. That's the one scary part. And then I think the other thing that kind of freaked me out, and I didn't tweet about this, but I thought about it recently, is that in a way this being done is kind of another case of human centipede stuff, because that same graphic shown to a QAnon person or an insane right-wing person would then be like a stamp of approval saying, see, the military thinks Antifa is dangerous, even though someone like Trump or Stephen Miller or someone else in the DoD who's getting orders from the commander in chief has to interrogate whether or not these dumb things are actually threats because that's the mission they're given. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. I mean, this is a sort of formal declaration of its legitimacy, even if it says the threat is low. I mean, they're listed literally next to transnational criminal organizations, which are real and are a threat.
Yeah, people. Unfortunately, civilians will like latch onto something military and give it a lot more, I guess, credence than it actually deserves. It's like anytime I see something advertised as like military grade steel, it's like that means it's shit. Actually, you're not convincing me of anything here when you're telling me that it's military grade, because I have military grade stuff. It falls apart constantly, and I go buy good stuff off the civilian market. Like, I don't wear military grade boots. I buy boots, from I spend $250 on some good boots because I don't want huge blisters on my feet. And the same thing comes from these reports, like you were saying. Somebody they're going to give credence to this. Like, look, they consider these people a threat. They consider these anarchists a threat. When it's like literally, I just had to create this report and say, here's the assessment. It's low, and nobody really goes beyond that. It's like reacting to a headline and not reading the actual story. And unfortunately, that's what everybody does now. We all just react to the headline and go from there. And then again, we're just creating these the thing. Just shit's just getting worse, basically. And it creates a hostile kind of environment, not only for the military that's down there, but for anybody who is trying to I guess interact with the military down there, because now, okay, the anarchists are a threat, so now the bikers for Trump dudes are going to come down, and they're all batshit insane, so they're going to come down with their guns and rattle guns and everything, and then you just have this like escalation going on, when all you could have done is just read the report with a kind of critical eye, and you wouldn't have these problems.
What's interesting is the public does seem to actually be the target for a lot of this stuff. So I had someone in DoD reach out to me a few days ago who explained to me that there's actually very little to almost no like PSYOP stuff going on, which is what you would expect if they're targeting like foreign bodies, like the migrant caravan. And he commented that if you look at it, the people that they're sending down for the rotations are overwhelming for the kind of information/comm stuff are overwhelmingly public affairs people. And then I sort of asked him what the significance of that was, and he said, well, it looks like they're more interested in targeting the media and then via that the public than they are in these supposedly threatening foreign actors.
Absolutely, yeah. It's look, we all know, and anybody with a shred of intelligence knows that there's no threat along the border, the Mexican border. Like, sure, maybe an Al-Qaeda guy could get in. But that I think Nate and I discussed it, how that would require such an insane amount of effort to go down. Like, you have to like fly into South America, and you have to there's this huge swampland that literally has no road to get through. What is that called, Nate? What's that swampland called?
Yeah, so the Darien Gap in Panama.
Darien Gap. Yeah. So, and here's what Al-Qaeda, all they have to do to get into America: fucking catch a flight and land at Chicago O'Hare, and they're in America. Like, it's not that difficult.
All Al-Qaeda has to do is be Saudi, which a lot of them are, and have enough money to get a visa to America, and then they're in America. Like, they don't need to walk overland with a caravan that's being, for one, that they're going to stick out like sore thumbs unless they speak fluent Central American Spanish. Also, like, that caravan is getting aggressed and marauded by fucking criminals every step of the way, because it's incredibly dangerous to make that crossing on foot. Like, and those people are constantly under threat. Like, it's such an absurd thing that only makes sense if you're racist and also really ill-informed. Like, think about the whole, we found prayer rugs in the desert, that means Al-Qaeda is coming. It's like, do you think that transnational terrorist organizations that operate in the Middle East, leave breadcrumb trails of prayer rugs everywhere they go? Like,
just discarding man jammies and prayer rugs all over the place. Like, damn it.
Exactly. You round them up and it's like, oh damn, I shouldn't have left all of those Qurans and prayer rugs everywhere I went.
It's like Wahhabi Blues Clues.
Yes. Well, I mean, and that's the thing I think that makes it so insane is that America's an absolutely absurd border policy and our absurd immigration policy and our inhumane asylum policies that Trump has made worse, but that were bad under Obama, have created a situation in which these people who want to seek asylum have no recourse other than to present themselves at the U.S. border to seek asylum. And as such, of course, there's going to be situations in which those folks may rather take their chances and try to get across the border, without documents, because as of today, they've tightened things up so much for asylum cases. They've made it as hard as possible for these people to even make their court dates with the intention of making them miss their court dates. So seeking legal asylum is effectively turned into like a route that people realize isn't useful. So they want to get away from the violence. They want to get away from ecological collapse. They want to get away from all of these situations that are that we have, on one hand, helped to contribute to, and on the other, have done nothing to do about. Once we've realized these are emergencies, and so these people, like, you can't expect them to sit and wait to get a green card when the waiting list for unskilled laborers is something like 21 years. For most of these countries, you can't expect them to claim asylum legally when you've made that impossible. So then they're going to cross the border. And so you say, okay, we're going to militarize the fuck out of the border and put troops down there. And now you have the situation in which the point of contact between, refugees seeking asylum or migrants seeking a safe haven is basically soldiers, troops, etc., out on the border. Like, it just seems like it's a recipe for confrontation and for potentially lethal problems, but then also like it's meant to make this into a bigger deal, like more of a culture war thing than it was before. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I want to loop back as Ken was talking about how there's more PAO down than there is PSYOP. That's exactly why, because this is more of a how do we sell this to the American people, not how do we use this to gain any kind of intel, or because honestly, if we were honestly worried about it, we would be doing psychological operations, and we'd have a lot more intel people down there. And I don't know what the numbers are. I don't know if there's a bunch of intel people down there right now, or what they're doing. Maybe they're all just sitting looking at computer screens, bored as everybody else. But if you have a lot of PAO people down there, what you're doing is you're having them take pictures of soldiers doing great and wonderful things and talk to the soldiers. And we only use the quotes that say happy, wonderful things about how great it is to be down here doing something great for America. And that's it. It's something, it's being sold. It's something that just has to be sold. And that's why you have your PAO people down there. And that's, that is the point to all of this, is to sell racism to America, which, like, honestly is not a hard sell, as it turns out.
Yeah, that's exactly the point that the person in the Pentagon was trying to make to me. And it's amazing because this person said to me, like, why has nobody reported this? Because it's a really, illustrative example for really, I mean, it's very Trump, right? It's like all a sort of media confabulation.
Absolutely. It's selling a TV show. Trump is really good at this because he's selling things to people. He's selling exactly what people want to them, and to his base. Like, Trump doesn't have to try to win his base. His base loves him. The Republican Party loves him, regardless of your handful of never Trumpers who can, also get yeeted into an ocean. He has exactly what he needs. And it's like, I see people saying like, oh, Stephen Miller should step down. Fucking Stephen Miller's not going to step down. None of these people will. None of this will be done gently. None of it would ever be done because there is no shame. There is no belief that they're doing anything wrong. Or even if there is, it's like, no, this is the right thing to do, even if you don't believe that it is. So there's like absolutely, no point to worrying about something like that. And, honestly, that's where this all comes down to, is how do we sell this particular thing? How do we sell the next war? How do we, look, Trump said ISIS is defeated. How many times has he said ISIS is 100% defeated? And then like, oh, by the way, we killed Baghdadi, and there's a new guy in charge of ISIS. ISIS is 100% defeated, but ISIS is doing operations, here, there, and everywhere else. It doesn't matter. Like, it's selling a TV show, and the people who want to watch the TV show and want to believe that it's real are going to watch the TV show and believe that it's real, while the rest of us, stand outside doing the, whoa face, like the Pikachu surprise face for the last 3 years. And unfortunately, like it took this long for the Democrats to finally say, well, maybe we need to go ahead and move on impeachment stuff. But it's like, dude, even if you impeach him, it's not going to work. Like, I don't believe that he would ever step down peacefully. Like, maybe we would get lucky enough and he would be like, oh, well, I'm going to step down because, I'm making the choice. They're not making the choice. I'm making the choice. You didn't fire me. I fucking quit. And there's a slight chance of that, but there's also a pretty big chance that if we did move through impeachment, we did impeach him, we said, okay, you got to fucking go, that he's not going to go anywhere. Even though, like, fucking Pence would be in charge. Like, it's not like we wouldn't have an insane racist in charge of everything. It's just you're removing like one layer of racism, but it's a racism onion, so it doesn't matter.
Talking about some of your other investigative work you've done since we most recently spoke, because it seems like you've been breaking some great stories, but a lot of this has been related to DoD sources, and so I was hoping to maybe talk like in a broader way about that. Yeah,
Ken, why do you hate the military, Ken? Why do you hate the troops?
Yeah, I hate them because they keep leaking to me. They give me so much work, and I'm inundated and all this stuff. So, but this segues nicely actually, because another target I wonder isn't just the public, but it might be the military itself. So I had one story about a Marine who went, it's kind of interesting. So he went missing, and this focus of all the stories was kind of this sort of feel good stuff. Is like, guys, let's come together and find him and then bring him home to his family or something. And then I got from, I guess I have to be vague. I got an FBI sort of internal bulletin they had saying what they wouldn't say publicly, which was that this guy had talked about wanting to go down to the border and massacre people that he thought were maybe human traffickers, which of course, that could mean anything. But so that part was never relayed to the public, and it was just like, oh, go say hi to this guy and ask him to go home or something. And in addition to that, he'd gone missing. He was supposed to show up at Camp Pendleton. Hadn't appeared, and then his guns went missing too. He had like a rifle, a handgun, a shotgun too. I think one other one, I can't remember what it was. But when I started looking into it, it turned out he had been on border rotation a little prior to that, and some military had told me that there was a tendency they were noticing when troops had been sent down rotation, they would actually come back more concerned about the border stuff and talking about this sort of kind of very similar to Trump rhetoric stuff about how they're coming here and we really need to worry about it. And so I wonder if that's another, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but it sounds like the effect is that they're coming back sort of radicalized about immigration stuff, because they'll go on these things with CBP, who already have a very, obviously reactionary view toward a lot of this stuff. And then so the CBP will take them around on a sort of guided tour, like, oh, this is where they're coming. We got to worry about this. There's gangs here. There's gangs there. And so I wonder if this is changing attitudes within the military too.
I mean, I'm sure that there's some, there's, your commanding officers, your commanding NCOs are probably down there. And, no matter where you're at, there's always somebody who's like full on drank the Kool-Aid and is 100% into the mission. And it's really easy to, present facts, like actual facts, but present them in a way that skews what the truth is. Like, if you want, like, I use the people will say, well, African Americans commit X amount of crime, but they're a lower amount of percentage, so therefore, and it's like, no, that's a surface level racism you're doing. You need to dive really deep into the racism of the country, the systematic white privilege and everything, and then nobody wants to hear about that. It's kind of the same thing. You can go down there and say, well, look how much crime there is in this Mexican city right across the border. I remember when I spent some time in Fort Bliss, and I was always told about how horrible Juarez is. And I just and at the time you just kind of take it as like, yeah, I mean, I bet it's a border town. Look over there. It looks kind of, it looks shitty compared to what I live in. So therefore it makes sense. But, nobody ever, and then you talk to people who have been to Juarez or lived in Juarez, and they're like, no, man, I mean, it's got its good parts. It's got its bad parts, like any normal city in any normal country in the world. So, it's not hard to really, do that kind of radicalization, again, for a troop. Because again, you're supposed to believe like, oh, I've been down here. I know what's up. You don't know what's up. So you learn from me and I'm telling you X, Y, and Z. And so you just start believing X, Y, and Z because, yeah, you haven't been there. Maybe you're, a soldier, a National Guard soldier from Washington State. What do you know about the border? What do you know about like Hispanic people other than going to, maybe a Mexican restaurant? Or, if you do have Hispanic people in your neighborhood, maybe you've met them, but you don't know, what's going on down in these border towns. So it's really easy to, I feel it'd be really easy to do something like that. And it wouldn't surprise me. Like, and I don't think that it would be this is a plan. This is, in our mission statement, also make the troops more racist. But it is just kind of a byproduct for how we as soldiers operate. And I'm sure Nate and I have talked about this numerous times, where to put yourself in a position, in Iraq or Afghanistan where you're comfortable with killing a person, you make sure that you don't think of them as a person. And so you probably have a huge othering of migrants that are coming over without ever putting in the consideration or the time to think about like, well, why are they coming over here? Let's do a little research into Honduras. Oh shit, which is the reaction you should have anytime you do any research as an American into a South or Central American country, is you say, let me read Wikipedia. Oh shit, we sure did fuck that one up, didn't we? But you don't really do a whole lot of research into things like that. And Nate, I'd be interested to see if you agree with that, considering you too were subjected to that during deployments.
Well, I mean, I do think that there's something to be said for, like, I personally believe that a lot of folks who are in the junior ranks in the military are not particularly political. But I also think that, like, their experiences oftentimes wind up politicizing them, and also certainly making them accept a framing in which, they see the people that are their declared enemy to be enemies regardless. And so as a result, for example, people who spent time in the Middle East, some folks come away from it with, a certain degree of curiosity about the region, but most folks come away with it with a very negative impression. And there's a part of me that thinks that a lot of this stuff, with framing refugees and migrants as the enemy and sending troops down to safeguard, in scare quotes, the border, this winds up creating a situation in which people who may not have been particularly political, but were, grew up in America and joined the military, and by this I'm saying white dudes mostly, wind up coming away from it with a much more radically xenophobic and racist viewpoint. And they're already pretty comfortable using weapons because it's been part of their job. That stuff freaks me out a lot. And so, Ken, when I read your story, I just thought to myself, like, wow, if this is what's happened with one guy, like, how many more people have the same sort of thought process as him, but haven't yet done something to profile themselves?
Exactly. And thank God he was apprehended. But, we had, according to the FBI bulletin I got, they had multiple informants telling him that this guy had said he was going to go and, quote, take them out. So this very easily could have just been, I was thinking as I was like scrambling to get it out because of course they didn't tell the public. And obviously, some stuff has to be secret with law enforcement, but it's like, if you're trying to prevent a mass shooting, I would think that people could, picture if the guy was Muslim. Do you think that they're going to not disclose that he wants to go take a bunch of people out? I think that probably would have gotten out.
Or think if this guy was Hispanic and he had decided that he had gotten, got so fed up from doing this shit that he's like, actually the U.S. military is being, he's being weaponized for racism, which is true. And he decides, I'm going to kill cops or something like that. Like, right. That shit would be on every fucking headline tomorrow.
Totally. So they didn't say anything. And I don't know if it's that they are, I've heard speculation from people I know that also there's an element of not wanting to embarrass the military. And then they know that this is going to go upstairs and it's going to look bad for the whole mission. I tried my best to sort of frame this as a, sort of near miss that thank God nothing happened. as you're saying, how many other folks are being sent down there and potentially getting radicalized and might, just 1% of them might snap or something. But because the media got it wrong initially and didn't look into it and just reported it as this kind of like, let's go out and help this poor guy. I think they didn't want to sort of correct it, because to write the truth of what happened would be sort of like admitting that you missed it initially. So I think it was largely lost. But yeah, I stay up worrying about that. I mean, all you would need is 1% to 2% of the people being sent on rotation to, just go off the deep end, and I was just thinking as I was writing it and hurrying to get it out, just thinking, oh God, is this going to be another one of these 7 people dead in Texas kind of stuff?
Yeah, like a Robert Bales kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Guy who loses his mind and decides he's going to take out civilians.
Right.
So I'm wondering, Ken, with what you've been covering recently, it seems to me like, the first time you came on the show, I think was earlier last year. And since then, the border, you think about this time last year, Trump was doing the whole thing where the troops were going to be away for Thanksgiving and troops were going to be away for Christmas because they were deployed to the border in support of, basically a gambit to shore up support during the midterm election. But now with so much stuff that's been kind of hogging the airwaves with regard to impeachment, which to be fair, the Ukraine stuff is insane. It seems like this stuff hasn't been in the headlines, but to my knowledge, it's still ongoing, and it's still the military doesn't have the ability to say, okay, this is fucking stupid, we're not doing it anymore. Until politicians stop the mission, it's going to keep happening. So as you've been reporting on this, have you felt similar frustrations like what you were just describing, that because of whatever's been happening in headlines, like this story, it's been harder for it to like, you publish something, but it doesn't get the same kind of airtime it might have when everyone was focused on the border?
Yeah, totally. I'm frustrated. What's strange is it gets a ton of sort of grassroots interest, like it always does on social media. People seem to perceive why it's important and seem concerned about it. But what it hasn't gotten pick up in is the MSM. I have so much frustration with places like the New York Times, because obviously the Ukraine thing is a huge and insane story. But they have a tendency to just sort of dogpile these things. And then it kills me, because then the smaller places, indie places, will sort of echo that. Obviously, they have less power to set the agenda that the big papers do. But then you have a sort of 24/7 cycle around Ukraine, where obviously, media resources are scarce and everything. But I don't know that we have to do almost exclusively that stuff. I mean, if your goal is to cover insane Trump stuff, there's plenty of other, obviously it's not going to rise to the level of impeachment, but impeachment isn't going to rise to the level of impeachment in the sense that we all know the Senate's not going to do anything about it. So I don't know what it is. And another thing is, when folks in the military reach out to me, I'm not the first person they reached out to very often. They will have reached out to other people and they just didn't do anything for them. And so there's I feel a lot of pressure to kind of make up for what everyone else, and God knows how many troops have reached out to press and then just given up because they don't know that different press have sort of different kind of institutional roles in terms of like what they'll cover and not. So, I mean, I would be shocked if the New York Times isn't sitting on just piles of stuff that they either haven't or won't report.
So I'm wondering, Ken, how are you holding up? Because you have to be online all the fucking time digging into this stuff and seeking out sources and looking at this and, and seeing how, every day there's a new revelation that, I mean, maybe you could pat ourselves on the back. We are confirmed as not being cranks because it's confirmed quite well that Stephen Miller, for example, is a white nationalist, and nobody who was paying attention can be surprised about that. But for you, at least, like, you're having to dig this stuff up, and you're going out, and you obviously like have a personal stake in it, given your family background. Like, how are you holding up?
I'm fine. What honestly really helped me was knowing about the third world. So, like, where my mom's from, El Salvador, they, someone who writes critically of the government, they just kill them. And so when you know that and have familiarity with that, it's hard for me I feel sort of self-pitying if I start to get depressed about it. Because, I mean, depression, feeling, seeing all this awful stuff is bad, but it's not as bad as getting killed. And then, I mean, just to look at the Romero case, it's so illustrative. It's like then they have the funeral for him, and then they gun down the funeral goers. That's the third world. That's our client states, So, I mean, it's way easier here than there. I would say it is depressing. And it's, I guess the biggest thing, I'm more angry than anything, because it's just always this impeachment circus, or like the minute Mueller stopped, again, it's fine that we had the Mueller investigation. I'm in support of that. But the extent to which it just took all of the air out of the room, when it ended, I was like, oh, great, now we can have a little bit more diverse coverage. And then immediately Ukraine, it's like, it's never going to end, so it's going to be some big 24/7 cable circus. And I mean, again, I'm not saying we only cover immigration or anything, but this stuff is pretty shocking. And in my opinion, this is the most extreme of Trump's battery of insane policies.
Yeah, because there's the 24/7 crime, corruption shit that he's constantly doing, but then there's also what having him at the head of all the apparatuses of state allows his close associates to do. Whether it's stuff with trying to privatize the VA or just, I mean, I hear stories all the time from guys that I know that were vets that, are being reinvestigated for their disability claims, or whether it's just like, them trying to let the EPA be run by chemical companies and industrial companies and things like that, whether it's basically rolling back on all the Justice Department's investigations of police abuses that were started under Obama, like basically because Trump's insane corruption, personal corruption dominates the headlines, it seems like it sucks up all the air, and that stops us from also getting the level of outrage deserved for the just institutional corruption that's happening across the country because Trump can rubber stamp whatever his cronies want to do. And that to me, I think, is what is so shocking, is that like I'm glad he's been caught in this stuff. I don't think anything's going to come of it because the Republicans aren't going to vote to impeach him in the Senate, but also when he's gone, whenever that is, and knock on wood, that's sooner rather than later, we still have to undo all of the shit that they've done, to include all these lifetime appointments for federal judges who have, whose only position is that they will vote for Republicans. They will rule in favor of Republicans no matter what. And you see just like this rampant corruption, and it's, I don't know, like all of it is bad, and effectively attention is a finite resource.
Yeah, totally. It's not that it's being covered, it's the uniformity of the coverage. And I hope if any military are listening to this and had either reached out to press and not had much luck, or considering that they consider contacting me, because I've tried really hard to not get caught up in what the major thing is, and that frees up a lot of time for me to be able to pursue other things. That's part of a privilege of being at a independent place that's given me some resources, but then also just not sort of doing the feeding frenzy that everyone else is doing.
I'd be interested to hear from soldiers who are part of our, I guess the ones who got sent into Syria, and they're just told like, all right, just post up outside of these oil wells and don't let anybody blow them up or do anything, because that seems like a real, like they did. We get told that we're going to be bringing troops back, and then we actually send more troops out, and then everybody's just like, well, I guess that's what we do now, is we have these troops out there. And I know I know people who are out there who have just redeployed, and I know people who are deploying to Syria, and it really seems like there's no real plan. And maybe there is a mission statement, maybe there is a plan when you're on the ground, but I just don't think that nobody's paying attention to it anymore. We're past Veterans Day, so nobody needs to care about soldiers until Memorial Day. So Ken, I appreciate you treating every day like it's Veterans Day.
That's my job.
So for this week's bonus, Francis and I talked about the Rambo franchise, Rambo 1 through 5, and whether or not it's fascist, and also whether or not it's good. So we're going to roll 10 minutes of that, and if you want to hear the whole thing, just get on the Patreon, which you can find the link in the show notes, and you can access it. We joke about this, about is it fascist, and I think that there is something alarming about the idea that all that's required for a Rambo movie to achieve its aim is for the enemy to be portrayed as so venal and cruel that everything they do is counterintuitive to their own goals, like counterproductive to what they're trying to accomplish because they're just so mean and cruel all the time. But then also, although they're insanely cruel and all-powerful and all consumed by their desire to do nothing but evil, they also are incredibly weak and can't stand up against one single man. It's in terms of the construction, it's not that different than like, a chivalric legend kind of thing where, the knight goes in and slays 100 Saracens, but it also wants to fixate on like the venality and the corruption and the cruelty of the enemy. And I think to me at least, when I think of this being portrayed where the enemy is now drug trafficking cartels in Mexico, and I think about some of the dialogues that have taken place in America, specifically with the way that all Hispanic immigrants are demonized in America as being MS-13 or being cartels or whatever the fuck, and the stupid shit that the kind of folks who like watching movies where, Green Berets massacre people are going to say, I'm really, really suspect of this, and in a way, it's strange. I think I could forgive the weaponization of John Rambo as a sort of new vehicle of how America perceives its military and its own place in the world. I mean, surely I think we can agree that Rambo First Blood Part 2 was part of this strange push to try and win Vietnam in the minds of people, or at least create this idea that Vietnam was to be won except for some kind of what the German Dolchstoßlegende, the idea of
it was kind of like getting closure, like because Vietnam War was already over, but
there's the stab in the back legend. That's what I'm saying though, is there's the stab in the back legend that we would have won except the corrupt politicians sold out our brave troops, and you can see that progression. But it's just weird because, to be honest with you, Rambo 4, which I've seen, and this film, which I haven't seen but you've described to me, don't even have the ideological underpinning of the sort of Cold War, anti-Soviet, we're here to do good and establish freedom. They want to, make people into slaves. Like, there's not even that framework of there being anything ideological about it. It's more like racist Judge Dredd, and there's nothing political. It's all just about the law can't protect you, power can't protect you. The only thing that can protect you is vigilantism and one hero who cares not for human life. And beyond like how cloying that is, there's just such emptiness there, if that makes sense. It's so devoid of any kind of hopeful vision at all. And it doesn't really engage with the reality of combat or the reality of life post-combat, because it's less a game, it's less a representation of how people behave in war and what war does to people, or even just a story of a conflict or a hypothetical conflict. And instead it's just kind of like really dark version of Virtua Cop.
Yeah, I really wish that I could sit people down who told me Rambo 4 sucks and like just be like, what? I want you to deep dive mentally into this, because my brain is broken and has been thinking about Rambo nonstop since I watched Rambo 5. And this is like my ability to finally rest on that, because now we've finally gotten this out. But like, I want to know, because like you said, it has that, you watch it and you're just like, this is devoid of use. Like there's no reason for these, where at least with Rambo 2 and Rambo 3, you have those, even though the enemy is cartoonishly bad, it still has some sort of like, heroism to it. It has some sort of purpose. Like there's purpose behind the violence. I don't know. Rambo 4 is just one of those, like, watching Rambo 4 and Rambo 5, I am more, I don't know if I'm convinced like that action movies are done, or if we just need to take a break from them for a while and come back later on in the year, because even 4 and 5 are still 11 years apart. And action movies in the 2000s, get, some of them are like really bloody. I haven't watched the John Wick movies. I keep meaning to, but I know that they are like very violent, but I don't think they're very gory. I don't believe
they're not. I mean, they're gorier than like the 80s equivalent. I saw somebody watching one of them on the plane when I was flying back from the United States, and I mean, there's definitely more like blood squib explosions than there were I guess more realistic ones than there were in 80s movies. But the John Wick movies are so theatrically, comically, acrobatic, violent that there's not really it doesn't try to inhabit this like gritty realism. I mean, it instead it's kind of, it felt like you were watching a combination of Neuromancer and The Matrix.
Right.
In terms of the aesthetic they've created, and it's so acrobatic. It's like a John Woo movie in that regard, where because of how over the top kind of like gunslinger samurai shit it is, it winds up not really registering as a portrayal of actual human violence.
Yeah, I think that with Rambo 5 and Rambo 4, there's a lot of, up close killing. There's a lot of punching. There's a lot of really close violence. But because it's Rambo, because it's Sylvester Stallone and he's old, he can't do the things that our boy Keanu Reeves at the age of 55, no less, can do. So
look, Johnny Utah would have played in the NFL, except he got injured. All right, so the fact remains he's still a world-class athlete.
Yeah, I feel like if I'm going to do an action movie, I want it to be some sort of like jump around, do cool flips, like and I don't know if you ever watched Equilibrium with Christian Bale, where they've got the gun kata.
No, but that's awesome.
Oh my God, Nate. Okay, we're watching that movie next. That movie is so dumb, but so.
But let me just throw this out there though. Like, yes. I think about Point Break, right? I think about Point Break and like some of the things, like the grittier scenes, like where they have the meth gang raid, and like it turns out that they've blown up a what's it called, ATF fucking agents undercover work. Like that's kind of gritty. But then also, Keanu Reeves plays a cop named Johnny Utah, who at one point has to fight half of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, because one of whom is named War Child, who are like a violent surf gang on the beach in Los Angeles. Like, it's such an absurd construction. They run around robbing banks dressed as former U.S. presidents, wearing rubber masks. It's such a suspension of disbelief. It doesn't want you to believe the world is completely real, and then also fixate on the absolute ugliest thing that it can portray. Like, no one in Point Break, the first one, the Catherine Bigelow movie, rips out another dude's collarbone, but a guy commits suicide by fucking surfing into the world's most dangerous wave. Like, Keanu Reeves jumps out of a plane without a parachute to chase after a fallen parachute, gets the parachute on, and then does skydive fighting with Gary Busey, who's already successfully donned his parachute and jumped out of the plane. Like, it's some of the dumbest shit I've ever seen in my life. And so because of that, you can just kind of get into it. And the violence, which is absolutely there, doesn't feel as shocking or like as graphic or as intentionally disturbing. Like, what you're describing to me sounds like Saw.
Yes, that's I felt that a lot of these things would have been not out of place in a horror movie, and it's like, what do you want to be? Do you want to be a horror movie? Just be a horror movie, because it does, like, it is triggering parts of my amygdala, my fight or flight or whatever lizard brain, because it's just like when you see like a bone get pulled out of a man, or you see the heart get pulled out of a man, or you see somebody step on a landmine and just explode into like a shower of blood. That's just like, oh God, like I don't watch Saw movies for a reason. I'm not into that. I don't expect those things out of my action movie. I remember one of the, I can't remember which Jason Statham movie it was. It's one of the earlier ones. Like, I think, it's Transporter. Transporter, like after when Jason Statham was like, I'm done with these silly British dark comedy movies. I'm going to be an action star now. At one point in time, he does a fight with a guy where like they're on a brushed concrete floor. They knock over, I guess, motor oil, so it's like really slippery. And Jason Statham like manages to keep himself up because he goes to a bicycle and it's got pedals that like you can strap to your feet, and breaks the pedals off and straps them to his feet and has them strapped to his feet, I guess, so that he's like clicking around on top of this. So he's got a little bit, like the other guys are like, whoa, we're slipping and falling. He's just like, I've got these goddamn bike pedals on my feet. Time to fucking kick you all in the face. And it's incredible. It is
British
incredible.
Marine Todd.
Oh God! Now we need to do a British Marine top. Oh, don't like you talking that way about the Queen. you can get that on Patreon at patreon.com/hellofawaitodie. You can get onto that sooner rather than later. By the end of the month, we're going to be doing the zine. So $10 a month gets you access, gets you the zine, and gets you the care package that goes out. Will be going out in December. If you are not wanting to do that, you will get the zine, a digital version of it for free a little bit later on. But all of our bonus stuff is there. You can see us on YouTube, see us on Twitter. Ken, where can we see you?
You can see me on Twitter. You can hit me on Signal at 202-510-1268 if it's anything sensitive. And I'm like the personal injury lawyer here. I'll fight for you. I love chatting with people, even if it's not directly relevant to a story. It always helps me to know. I always try to talk to the people on the ground that are actually doing it, as opposed to bureaucrats or other media. So, great to talk to you guys.
Yeah,
thanks so much for being on.
It's funny. It was funny to me, Ken, when anytime you and I would be DMing about not even anything important, and anytime there's more than 3 exchanges, you're just like, hey, are you on Signal? Like, dude, we're not even talking. It seems you have a knee jerk. It's like, no, talk to me on Signal. So I have Signal now because of you, Ken. So thank you. Now all of my shit posting to you will be highly secured, I guess.
That's me, the Johnny Appleseed of encryption.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Ken, thanks for coming back on. Always great to have you on to talk about the fucked up stuff the military is doing from a different perspective. And for everybody else, we'll talk to you next week.